class. So this week we're covering part of chapter 13, a researcher's writing and presentation tools. So by the end of this chapter, you should be able to list and describe the sections of a research article. You should be able to describe the design elements of a research presentation, critique a research report or presentation, and then explain what is meant by plagiarism and how to avoid it. So getting the word out, getting your research out there, how do we do that? So you can publish in professional journals. You can also do presentations at national and local conferences. We have two specifically that we do in social work. We have the NSW and the CSWE. So both are done yearly. The NSW one is done locally, either in Arlington or Galveston. So 1 year is in Arlington, 1 year is in Galveston, and then they switch back. The CSWE is a national one, and it's usually all over the US. So universities from all over the US come together and present their research. Another way to get your word out is to do reports to legislators and policymakers. So if you're trying to get a policy changed or if you're trying to get a new policy implemented or developed, then you can, write something to the legislators, create a report for them. You can also do this by doing grant applications. So if you're doing a grant application for funding for either an existing program or a new program, that's another way you'll be doing research as well. You have to provide evidence for that. So you can also educate the community groups through reports in newsletters or creating annual reports. You can also support accountability to board members through written reports, in support administration through reports of process and the outcome studies. Also document the outcomes for practice at the worker level to enhance individual practice. All right, so for journal publications, the journal houses core knowledge of social work. So these journals collect research from so many areas, or the journal may be specific to certain areas of social work. And so whenever you write something, you would submit to a journal that applies to what you're writing about. These journals inform the profession about different things. So they inform the social work profession about new theories available or new evidence to support or reject these theories. They provide information about new interventions that may be developed that's out there that your program may not know about. It also provides information on results of the evaluations of these programs. So whenever people do an evaluation of a specific program, they may write up the results and they may get it published. And so that's another way that you can access information about a specific intervention or specific evaluations of programs. They also inform us about new social problems. So if there's a new problem developing, it keeps us informed about that as well. So it can inform us about new problems or our community is facing, as well as our individual clients. It also provides research that needs to be done. So we can look up research articles and we can tell, okay, so we have the answer to this, but now we need to know this. So it tells us what still needs to be done, what still needs to be researched. So there's more than about 200 social work related journals out there, and these journals have specific mission and focus. Like I mentioned before, whenever you publish something or whenever you are interested in getting something published, you look up the journals out there and see where your article would fit. And you can look at their reputation and also their acceptance rates. So there's 3 different types of journals. There's the referee journals. These are where you have editor and board with expertise in that specific area, and they're blind reviews by several reviewers. So this means that whenever you submit an article, it will be reviewed by several people without them knowing the author's name. So when you submit something, you'll submit something without a cover page or without your name on the cover page. That way they can review everything without knowing who wrote it. This one may take a year or more before it actually gets published. With the non-refereed, they still have an editor on board with an expertise in the area. However, the paper may be invited and the reviewers know the author's name. So with this one, it may lead to some bias and acceptance because the reviewers already know who wrote the paper. With the online journals, these may be either refereed or non-refereed. So whether you have blind review or they know who you are, the publication is online, so it's not in print. And with the online journals, there's a faster turnaround for publication time, and it could be as little as a month. So the format for social work, as you all probably know by now, is the APA format, the American Psychological Association. And so most of our social work manuscripts will also be in that format. So whenever you write in the social work program, you're going to use the APA format. Whenever you're submitting to a journal, it's highly likely that it's going to be the APA format. So it has specific rules about the style, the format, and the references. If you look at these two examples here, the first reference is in the correct APA format, but the second one is not. Can you look at this and tell what's the difference between the two? There are several differences. All right, so the first one is correct, the second one is not. So looking at the first one, you can tell that the second one does not have the date in the right place. Also, their first name is spelled out in the second one when you should only use the initial. Also, the title is capitalized, so only the first letter of the first word should be capitalized. Let's see what else. Also, the journal article should be italicized. And the volume and issue numbers, so you don't spell out the volume, and the volume doesn't go in parentheses. The volume is the first one, and then the issue goes in parentheses. And finally, with pages, you only list the page number. So you don't put the P and you don't put 19 pages. All right, so keep this as an example to be able to see how you cite your sources in your reference list and how to write out the reference list or the reference for your journal article. All right, so what are the sections of a research article? First, you have your title, right? That's where you have your title of the paper, the author's names, and their affiliation. So their affiliation is basically, normally, university professors are the ones that's publishing, and so their affiliation is going to be the university. If you're writing something and you're not with a university, but you're with an agency, then your affiliation is going to be your agency's name. You're also going to include an abstract where you include keywords. So the abstract is a brief summary of all of your sections of the paper. So a brief summary of your entire paper. Your keywords help people to find your article easier. So whenever someone is searching, let's say your article is on domestic violence. Whenever someone goes in and they type domestic violence in a search bar or a search engine, it may pull up your article, right? Depending on how many articles on domestic violence there is. But it should pull up your article. So for your final project plan, you will include an abstract. On all the other papers for the class, you don't need an abstract. So you do need an abstract for your final paper, but not for anything else. Usually, you include an abstract whenever you're doing a research paper. So like a full research project. All right, so next, your introduction to the paper. Here is where you're gonna provide the purpose of the paper. You're gonna tell us the importance of the study. Why is this important? You're also going to provide a linkage to previous literature to provide a rationale and context for your study. So you're going to basically give a little introduction of your topic, why is it important, the purpose of it, and what the literature has said about the topic so that we can see why your topic is needed now. It's really important that in research papers that you use the most recent articles out there. So we try to stay within 10 years. So nothing over 10 years old. Your concepts and variables should be clearly defined. Your research questions and your hypothesis should also be clearly stated and include any discussion on any ethical issues that might apply to your topic. All right, so next we have the method. So here's where you're going to talk about your population and sample selection. So who is your participants? How did you select them? You're going to talk about validity and reliability of your research instrument. So if you're using standardized measurements, these are easy to find. You will find research articles that talk about it and they have this information provided. If you are developing your own measurement, then you need to develop or you need to talk about how you're going to measure validity and reliability of your instrument. You're going to talk about your research design. So what design did you select? Was it a cross-sectional? Was it a quasi-experimental? What was your design that you're using? Next, you're going to talk about your research procedures. So this is where you talk about your data collection. How are you doing this? Step-by-step approach of what was done or what you're doing for your research project. So you should talk about any issues and sources of bias that you may have. You should also provide enough detail to permit judgment of the soundness of your research method and to replicate in the future. So basically, what you're doing here is you need to provide enough information so that people can make a judgment of the soundness of your research project and also that they should be able to replicate this in the future if they wanted to. Okay, so in terms of your results, you will summarize your major findings. So here you're going to present an analysis of the information to answer your research question. So you're starting off with the simple things. You're going to start off with your descriptives and talk about describing your sample and what percent was male, what percent was females, and your race and ethnicity, their age, all of those things. You're starting off with the simple things, right? Then you move on to the more complex. So then you move on to what statistical test results show. Like if you did a t-test or a ANOVA and all of that, then you're gonna actually describe those. You're gonna include all your demographic data and summary statistics. You're gonna talk about the statistical tests that you use and the rationale for using them. So there must be a reason why you selected a t-test versus an ANOVA. You can use tables and graphs wherever they're useful. Again, if you're using a table, make sure that the information that you're reporting in writing does not say the same thing that's in your table. So the table is more of a visual display of the information. So that means that if you're providing a table, then when you're writing it up, you don't have to provide all that information that you already provided in the table. So maybe provide a brief summary in writing and then provide more detailed information in the table. You need to provide the sample of the data if it's qualitative. So in the results section, you're only reporting your results. You're not interpreting it. You're going to interpret it later on in the discussion section. So all you have to say in your results section is basically report your results as is. So a t-test shows that males significantly differed from females in terms of their study habits. That's it. You're only reporting your results. You're not telling us what it means at that point. So reporting statistics depends on who your audience is. So as far as percentages, you can use that for any audiences that you're presenting to. You can use graphs and tables for most of your audience. However, when you're using statistical significance, you may want to save that for those who are research savvy. When it comes to statistical significance, people need to know what that means. And so if you're presenting to an audience who are not research savvy, they're not really familiar with research and all the research terms, then you may not want to use that. And then you have the discussion section. This section is where you're going to summarize your major findings. You are going to interpret the results here. So you're going to provide meaning and implications of your findings. So what does the results mean? What implications does it have? You also need to connect your results to previous research. So how does your results compare with the previous research? How does your results fit with what research says about your topic? You also need to discuss implications for social work practice here. So what does it all mean for social work practice? And then what is the need for further research? Based on your results, what else should we be researching? Also need to include your limitations of the project. So just about every research project has limitations. And so ignoring them or not reporting them does not really look good. It just seems like you're hiding something. So always report your limitations. So if you have any generalization issues, you need to include that. That usually happens whenever you don't randomly select your participants. You need to talk about any design weaknesses that you may have. So for example, if you use a cross-sectional study, then that may be a weakness because there's different things you need to consider in terms of when you ask a question at one point in time, there's no pre-test, post-test, you're going to have some limitations to that study. And we're going to discuss all of these later on as we talk about design and different things like that. So right now we're just kind of brushing up on the overview of these things. So if you don't really quite understand about the different designs and things like that, we're going to talk about that when we get to those chapters. So also talk about what questions were not answered by the research. That can also be a limitation. All right, so once your research project is done, once you've done your research, you collected your data, you analyzed your results. Now you talked about your discussion, what it means, what your results all mean. Now you want to present your work. So you want to present your research. Well, there's different ways that you can do that. So if you're doing a live presentation, you can do it at a conference, like we mentioned before, NASW or CSWE. You can choose to do it at one of those conferences. You can also choose other conferences. There's so many other conferences out there. You just need to decide where your paper best fits. You can present this at professional meetings, community groups, or any television, radio, or other media sources. Here are some presentation tips. Don't read your material, you want to discuss it. So you want to tell us what it all means. You don't want to have a presentation and just read everything. You want to explain it. You want to discuss it. You want to make sure you check the room. Make sure you check for equipment before starting. You want to make sure everything's working. Don't just depend that, oh, it's there, it's prepared for me. Even if you have someone that is in charge of that, make sure that you double check everything before you get started. You don't want to be up there starting a presentation and then all of a sudden the equipment doesn't work. Bring backup materials. Anything can happen. If you have a presentation and you need to make sure you have different ways of that presentation. So email it to yourself, have it on a flash drive, have someone else have it as well. Just make sure you have backup in case something happens, in case you lose your flash drive, or if you just email it to yourself and the internet doesn't work or something. So you should always have about at least 2 different ways of being able to access that information or being able to access it. You also want to bring hard copy handouts. Some people like to have the hard copy in their hands and they can follow along with that. So bring hard copy. And in terms of your presentation, you want to make sure that you're interacting with your audience. You don't want to just be standing up in the front behind the podium. You want to make sure that you kind of walk around a little bit or interact with them. You want to make sure you're acknowledging their input. And one major thing, don't argue with them. Don't argue with your audience. I know sometimes they may say things that goes against what you're speaking about or what you believe in, but everybody has their right to an opinion. And so try not to argue with them, agree to disagree, or, provide evidence as, why you're saying what you're saying, but just don't, engage in any arguments with your audience. And one major important thing, practice, right? Practice, practice, practice. Make sure you're prepared. Make sure that you can go up there in front of people, especially if you've never done it before. Practice behind the scenes. Practice, in front of a mirror, or practice in front of a group of friends. Just make sure that you do the presentation out loud at least one time before you actually present it. A lot of times we develop the presentation, it's our work, so it's like, okay, we know it, but if you don't like speak it out loud, you don't hear yourself, right? Sometimes practicing out loud, you hear what you're saying and you're like, oh wait, that's not what I meant to say, or wait, that didn't sound right. So at least practice before you present. Okay, poster sessions. So that was a live presentation. So that was the one we just discussed, where you just stand up in front of a room and you present your information. You can also present your information, but in a poster format. So with the poster, you can do, generally they're like a poster where it's a cardboard or poster board, and that's how you put all your information on. So these are simultaneous presentations at these professional meetings, and they are usually done on poster boards or a laptop and projector. So in the past, it has been on poster board, but they're moving more and more towards doing it in the electronic format, especially what's going on now. That works out so good because, it's easy to just have virtual presentations. Some professional meetings may have specific formats for their poster, and they're going to tell you what that is, or some of them may have a specific format that they send to you and you just put your information on there. But either way, they're going to tell you the sizes and things like that, what you need for it. So whenever you're doing a poster, you want to make sure that the lettering is large enough so that people can read it at least 6 feet away. You also want to use pictures and graphs, and don't include anything that's unnecessary. So the way that poster works, you have a room full of different posters, and that's why it says make it large enough where people can read like 6 feet away. So with the posters, people just walk around from poster to poster, and if they're interested, if they see something they're interested in, they may stop by, and then you as the presenter just go through your research process, or you just kind of explain your poster, what it's about, and basically your results and what you're saying. That's how you do that. So when they're walking around, making it large enough where they can read it 6 feet apart, it's pretty good because, they may not necessarily just have to stop and see everything. They could be reading your poster and still getting the information. So a funny story about the first time I presented at a conference. So I was in my PhD program and I was presenting my master's thesis at a national conference, and it was in Atlanta, Georgia. I had just recently had a baby. I think my baby was about a month old. Yes. And so I was flying out to Atlanta one day and presenting and coming back the next day. And so my first presentation was a poster presentation. And so it was on a poster board, and got to the airport, went through security and everything. Once I was through security, I realized I don't have my poster with me. I called my husband and I said, did I leave my poster in the car? Guess what? I did leave it in the car. And I'm like, well, I need that. So you need to turn around and come back. I had to go back out, go through security. Go back out, right? Go get my poster, go back through security all over again. Barely made it through security in time to get on the plane. The plane was like last call. I almost missed my flight. So my very first presentation, almost missed my flight, almost left my poster board behind. And so perfect example of, having backup, or in this case, it was hard to have a backup because hello, it's a poster board, unless I would have the other person that was presenting with me if they had one, right? So with the electronic version, or having being able to do your posters now electronically, it definitely takes away from you forgetting your poster board. I'm really excited about that. I have done the electronic ones as well. I think the last time I presented, it was it was the electronic ones, or it basically they have a computer screen or TV screen or something, and your poster is presented on there. So that is so much better. You can just, email it to yourself, or you can just have I think you have a flash drive and you just connect your flash drive to it, and that's how it works. So that's so much more better than having the poster board. But yeah, crazy. I cannot believe I was like about to lose my mind. I was leaving my poster board behind. Can you imagine flying all the way to Atlanta and not having your presentation with you? That would not have been good. So, presentation software is increasingly common and professional now. You can select an appropriate theme for that, making sure that one slide per minute of talking, using light text with dark backgrounds for projection. Again, you want to make sure that you put like one idea per page or one idea per line, 6 lines per page, 6 words per line, making sure you use large enough fonts like 24-inch font. Try not to go any smaller than that, and making sure that you use graphics for interest. Just a few tips about how to display your presentation. Workshops is also another way for you to be able to get your information out there, how to present your information. When it comes to workshops, they're usually used for training or education. I don't know if you guys have done any for like work or your internship. You may have done some of those, either did a workshop or attended one. These should clearly state the objectives, they should be measurable. You should also have an agenda for this workshop. They usually last about an hour and a half to 3 hours, so it definitely needs to be something structured. You need to have a plan. Because this one takes more time, it's an hour and a half to 3 hours, you definitely want to have activities or group discussion. You want to have specific activities for them to be able to do. I wouldn't try to talk for an hour and a half to 3 hours. That's just a lot of times to talk. It's a long time to talk. And even if you can talk for an hour and a half to 3 hours, nobody really wants to sit and listen to someone talk for that long, right? You need to be able to engage your audience. You need to be able to have them, involved, have them interact. If not, they're not gonna just sit there and listen to you for that long. You also want to have an evaluation of your workshop, because you want to see what needs to be changed, what you can do better for next time. Maybe you can get some ideas from your participants as to what can be changed, and also try to make it enjoyable. Like I said, an hour and a half to 3 hours, you need to make sure it's, you know, I wouldn't say entertaining, but you need to make sure that it's engaging and you can keep their attention. Here's an example of what an evaluation could look like for your workshop. You can have some open-ended questions, and also use a scale where they can just rate your answers. All right, plagiarism. Okay, so at this point, you guys are all graduate students. I'm pretty sure you've heard this term so many different times, but especially with writing and research, we want to make sure that we go over this again. This is a really important topic, and we need to make sure that we're reminded of it and how it works. Basically, with plagiarism, it's when you take someone else's information and you use it as your own, and you don't give them credit for it, whether it's someone else's words or their ideas. If it's not your own, you need to make sure you're giving the person credit for it. So, with intentional plagiarism, you basically take someone else's words or ideas and you don't cite it properly. So, you don't give them credit for it, whether you didn't give them credit for it in your in-text citations or in your references, you just didn't give them credit. Okay, so that's intentional. You just decided, oh, I'm going to take this. This fits perfectly with what I'm writing. I'm just going to add this in there and pass it on as my own. Paraphrasing is as much plagiarism as using the exact same word. So even when you paraphrase, so even if you took someone's words and you put it in your own words, guess what? It's still not your work. You got the idea from someone else, and so you still need to cite it. So if you took someone else's words and you made it your own, you wrote it in your own words, you still need to cite. And the way you would cite it is basically the difference between citing, paraphrasing, and exact words is that with exact words, you use quotation marks. And when you cite it, you include the author's last name, the year of the publication, and also the specific page number that you took the quotation from. When you're paraphrasing, you don't use quotation marks, but when you cite it, you cite the author's last name and the year that it was published. You don't include page number. Page number and quotation is only when you use direct quotes, the exact words. But when you paraphrase, sometimes people think, oh, I changed it into my own words, so I don't have to cite my source. Yes, it's still their idea. It may be in your words, but it's their ideas, and so you still have to cite. If you're using facts or statistics, graphs, drawings, music, or anything that is not considered common knowledge, and you don't give the person credit for it, it's still plagiarism. So anything that's not common knowledge needs to be cited. So using someone's exact words without using quotation marks is plagiarism, even if the source is cited. So let's say you decided to use word for word and you cited the source. So you ended up putting the author's name and the year, and you felt like, oh, I cited it. Well, you still need to add quotation marks. Remember, if it's their exact words, you need to put quotation marks. The only way you don't use quotation marks is if you change it into your own words. So if you paraphrase, then no quotation marks. However, if it's word for word, don't forget your quotation marks. Don't forget to include the page number in the citation as well. So if someone emails you something and you decided to use that, or if someone told you something and you decided to use that and you didn't cite it, it's still plagiarism. So whenever someone tells you something, it's listed as personal communication. So whenever you cite it as personal communication, and it's a specific way that you would do that. Check your APA guideline for that. So if you have the APA book, you'll see it on there. If not, there's also online resources where you can find that as well. However, personal communication has its own way of how you cite that. First of all, it only goes in the paper. It goes in text. It does not go in your reference list. So a lot of times students get that confused and they put personal communication in the reference list, but they don't cite it in text. That's incorrect. So if you're citing something that someone told you in text, if you used it, what you'll do is cite it in text as personal communication. I think it's their last name, first initial, personal communication, and the date that they told you. And so that goes in text within the paper, but you don't have to do anything for that in the reference list. So just double check, look at your guidelines, for APA guidelines for personal communication, and make sure you check that before you try to cite it. So if you just forgot to cite, it's still plagiarism. So let's say you were writing your paper and you're like, I'll get that later, I'll come back later. And at the end you forgot and you just submitted your paper, it's still considered plagiarism. So when you're writing your paper, if you forgot to cite, highlight it or write yourself a note next to it to remind yourself that you still need to cite. Even if you didn't know, it's still plagiarism. So let's say you use something else. So let's say you use someone's words or ideas and you just didn't know that you had to cite it. It's still plagiarism. Okay, here are some examples of what is not plagiarism. If it's your own words, your own ideas, your own creation, then that is not plagiarism. For example, I think they got research to prove it works, got research to prove it don't, and they call that science. That's your ideas. That's your own words. That's you. That's what your opinion is. You're saying that. So guess what? That is not plagiarism. You don't have to cite anything because you came up with that on your own. Those are your ideas. Those are your opinions. Common knowledge, you don't have to cite that. So if it's something that is just common knowledge, everybody knows that, then no need to cite either. It's not plagiarism if you use it. George Washington was the first president of the United States. So if you include that in your paper and you state that George Washington was the first president of the US, then that's common knowledge, right? You don't have to cite that. The sky is blue. Again, common knowledge, you don't have to cite that. Improper citation of references is not quite plagiarism. So if you incorrectly cite your references, then it's just ignorant or careless, but it's not dishonest. So in terms of ethics and politics of reports, so make sure you're applying our social work ethics in those reports. This includes truthfully and accurately reporting the results, also making sure you're maintaining confidentiality, you don't want to be reinforcing any stereotypes, and also that your work shows that you're working for social and economic justice. So when it comes to language, you want to make sure you're using gender neutral terms. So instead of saying policeman, policewoman, just say police officer. Instead of saying saleswoman, salesman, just say a salesperson, sales associate, sales clerk. Same thing with a waiter, waitress, just say server, things like that. So just making sure that you're including everyone, because just using, for example, a chairman instead of a chairperson, you're just assuming that the person is a man, and you're not being inclusive. Use terms preferred by diverse populations. So again, it's important that you know who your audience is and you know who you're presenting this to. You want to make sure that you know what terms to use. You want to use terms that they prefer. So if you're not sure, just ask them. Also, making sure that you're using language that fits your audience. It's important that you know who your audience is ahead of time. That way you can use language that fits them. When it comes to values, you want to make sure you state your values explicitly. You need to make sure that you state the limitations of your study, like we mentioned earlier. You need to make sure you inform people of what the limitations may be for that study. And you need to make sure that you can expect and defend criticisms about your research, especially if you're doing controversial topics. In terms of organizational issues, you don't want any surprises. So if there's anything surprising or anything shocking about your results, you want to make sure you talk to stakeholders ahead of time about those results before you present it. Make sure you have a clear memorandum or understanding concerning the publication, and give appropriate credit. So appropriate credit has to do with authorship, and these things need to be talked about before you actually start the study. So when it comes to publications, authorship is important. So if you're planning on publishing your work and you're working with other people, you need to talk about this beforehand. So everybody needs to be in agreement about who's going to do what. Everybody needs to be in agreement in terms of how authorship is going to work. And the way authorship works is when you're publishing something, your name is listed on that publication in terms of who's first author, who's second author, who's third author, and so forth. So the way it's determined, first author is usually the person who does most of the work. Basically, let's say I have this research project idea and I want other people to work on it with me. Pretty likely that I'm going to be first author. It's my idea, it's my project. I'm going to do most of the work. And I'm asking for other people to work on it with me. And so we need to have a conversation as to, who's going to be second author, who's going to be third author, and things like that. And this is something that needs to be done ahead of time, because it can get tricky if you just wait till you're done and then you just put people's names on there. Everybody needs to know that ahead of time and know what to expect. All right, and I think this brings us to the end of the part of chapter 13 that we're covering today. Hopefully you have a better idea of writing and research and the different parts of writing in terms of your research project, and also got a reminder on plagiarism and what's considered plagiarism and what's not, and having that in mind as you write your papers.